Testing. Good to go? All right, starting it up. Hi, everyone. I'm Ariel. I am the lead audio designer of Saints Row the Third. Thank you for coming. To start off, to kind of get to know what you guys are up to here. Who here has worked directly with voice before? Show of hands. Oh, man. Okay, this is great. I'm not even going to ask the follow-up. Great. Well, I recently wrapped up my work on Saints Row the Third with voice, and I emerged on the other side, a hollow shell of a man. No, I'm just kidding. I actually really enjoyed the work. To set the stage, Volition built a lot of new tools for Saints Row the Third, and in audio, we adopted Wise as our middleware solution. We started working with a new voice recording studio, and we also built a proprietary voice editor from the ground up. And the name of this, this was used to manage our voice and to implement lines into the game and things like that. And the name of this tool was Taco, which is why the motif of my presentations is tacos. And also, I love tacos, and I want them to be part of my life, my entire life. Because of these changes, we had a lot of opportunities to learn about voice, and in particular, 3 lessons stood out to me at the end. Lesson number 1, scope your voice content based on what's going to be meaningful to your player. Lesson number 2, staff your voice team by considering every last detail of the work. And lesson number 3, voice is complicated. So don't oversimplify it. The overarching antagonist of this little story is money. Voice isn't cheap. We spent about $1.2 million on voice, and that doesn't include overhead of my time or other internal people's time. What that got us was about 125 voice actors and about 82,000 lines. Lines per actor varied between dozens and thousands, and so recording session lengths would vary between a couple hours and many days per actor. After all of this money was spent, we had more story character and player character lines written than money to record it, even with that budget. We weren't able to record everything because voice work is filled with traps, and mistakes in voice can actually be very expensive, particularly if they're made towards the end of the project. The good news is that these traps can be prepared for and avoided. This talk is not specific to any discipline or tools or vendors. The principles should be able to be applied to any developer that's working with voice. And the hope is that you do apply these principles and that you improve on them. And if you do, I would love to hear about it, so I'll be giving you guys my contact information at the end of the presentation. So getting into it, lesson number 1, scope your voice based on what's going to be meaningful to your player. And how do we control scope in voice? We build relationships with key people that are able to help us control scope. And we also have our content prioritized in such a way that we can advocate for cuts later to keep our scope manageable. So first, building relationships. It's my opinion that it's never too early to get involved with voice planning. You're going to want to talk to producers and project managers and, of course, designers and writers and just figure out what their plans are for voice. And you don't have to wait for these people to come to you either. You can I would actually recommend that you insert yourself into these discussions. Just be like this taco, just crash the little discussion fiesta that's going on. It's important for us to all plan together because we all have a different perspective to offer. And audio's perspective in particular is important because we deal with a lot of limitations. So we're going to have technical limitations, like, for example, we'll have a finite amount of memory and streaming bandwidth that we can allocate towards voice. And we also have limitations in our voice playback systems. And we also have time bandwidth limitations. Internal audio teams can be sort of small, and so particularly towards the end of the project, it can be easy to sort of overscope your audio team. So being involved early means that you can change your scope and assess it in real time. Scope adjustments can become very difficult later as budgets become less flexible. Too often, plans are sort of set into motion without including audio from the beginning, and then audio has to react to those plans. And a lot of times those plans don't even fit with our voice playback systems, and so that can actually lead to additional work for other disciplines like programming. Continued involvement means that you're going to be able to better expose the hidden work in other people's voice plans. In fact, I just did a gut check on the scope of this presentation, and I've decided to cut the next slide. Oh, it's a good slide. So you're involved, and now it's time to prioritize. But before I get into that, I want to define this terminology that we used here at Volition. We have a line, which is the actual thing that's being said. In this example, it's bon appetit wimp. And then you have a situation, which is a collection of lines. In this example, it's combat taco attack. And then finally, you have a persona, which is a collection of line situations. This is basically everything that any particular character has available to say in-game. So we start our prioritization with the highest level object, which is the persona. So first you ask yourself, how important is this persona to the player? And this is going to depend on your game, and especially on what you think is going to be meaningful to your player. For example, on Saints Row, what we considered the most important personas were the player character and story character personas, because they had a lot of lines that advanced the story. The least important personas were generic NPCs that didn't have lines that advanced the story and didn't have lines that reflected the player's actions in the world. And we called these pedestrians or PEDs, which I'll talk about later. Next, you want to ask yourself, how important is this situation to the player? Again, it's going to depend on your game and what you think is going to be meaningful to your player. For example, if you're an action game, then your combat lines might be, combat situations might be more important or a higher priority. And if your combat game is a tactical combat game, then your situations involving cover might be more important than in a run-and-gun game like Saints Row the Third. And finally, you're going to ask yourself, how important is this line to the player? On Saints Row the Third, for story-related lines, the most important ones were the ones that caused the player to feel a strong emotion, or advanced a critical section of the story, or told the player kind of like what to do next. For non-story lines, the most important ones were the ones that reflected the player's actions in the world. Or also in Saints Row's case, the funniest jokes. Again, the point here is that you want to be thinking about what's important to your player throughout this exercise. So you've built relationships through planning and involvement, and you've got your content prioritized. So you should have the information that you need to be able to advocate for cuts. And the reason that we advocate for cuts is to keep the scope of our voice work manageable. And that's salsa. That's just salsa on the chainsaw. It's blood. It's blood. Totally blood. So cutting personas tends to affect world character diversity more than it necessarily affects line diversity, because what you're doing when you cut a persona is you're essentially eliminating a person from your game. But all the other personas get to keep all the lines that they have. In terms of savings, on Saints Row, by cutting a pedestrian, a generic NPC, you get about a few hundred lines saved. If you cut a story character persona, you're going to save about 500 lines. And if you cut a player persona, you save about 2,000 lines. And on Saints Row the Third, we had 7 different player voice options that the player could choose from, so that's 14,000 lines right there. And we actually had the foresight to cut an 8th player persona, fortunately. It was an auto-tuned player voice, so it was a really painful cut, but it was the right decision in terms of scope. I know. Hey, it was a good decision. Cutting situations and lines can often give you the best bang for the buck in terms of savings, especially for memory. So for example, if you have 100 personas, and 10 of those personas have fewer than 100 lines, then you're actually going to get better savings by cutting 1 line across every persona than cutting any of those 10 personas wholesale that have less than 100 lines. So this can get kind of complicated and mathy, so what we're going to be doing in the future is setting up an Excel spreadsheet to do this for us and tell us where we're going to get our best savings. So finally, cutting lines can be really painful, especially if people are going to be cutting like your favorite line. But it's up to all of us to sort of remind each other that the player doesn't know what they're missing in this case. So as long as the line exists to cover critical information, a lot of the times the line can be cut. So when people do inevitably start to lament the loss of like their favorite lines, you're just going to want to kind of take them in your arms like this. You're going to want to gently caress their hair like so, and just tell them everything's going to be okay, because the player didn't know that those lines existed in the first place. On to the next lesson. Staff your voice team considering every last detail of the work. Don't be too proud. As game developers and audio designers, we're all very proud people, and we think we can get everything done ourselves, and we usually can, but the question is at what cost? So the 3 positions I'm talking about today are the positions of the voice producer, temporary assistants, and voice QA. First up, the voice producer. This is someone who owns voice from beginning to end. They're not going to be doing all of the work, but they're going to be helping coordinate all of the work. We had a voice producer on Saints Row the Third, and his name was David Cubberly, and we loved him. And I mean, if you just kind of look at the tacos here, those hearts, that means love. That's how we felt about Dave. Highly recommend this role. The voice producer also knows the plan and has lots of contingency plans in place for potential issues. So things like scheduling issues at the recording studio, or a demo that might require final voice earlier than it was originally being planned on being delivered, and identifying staffing holes. The voice producer always knows who is working on what and when, and where to get answers to your questions. The nature of voice work is that it changes hands frequently. So, for example, a designer might identify the need for a line, then a writer then writes the line, then a recording studio then records the line, then the audio designer gets the line back, implements it into the game, maybe does post-production, then designer and QA test, and then there's iterations. So this is the voice is changing hands frequently, and what you want is one big know-it-all burrito guy to go to with your questions, and he'll be able to get you the answers. The voice producer burrito can have other work. It just shouldn't compete in priority with his voice work, with their voice work, I should say. Our voice producer even did some implementation into the game, but the problem was that he did frequently have work that competed in priority. So this is something that we're going to be emphasizing going forward, which is that this voice producer, whatever else they're working on, they can just drop it when voice work comes up. And just so that there's no confusion, David Cubberly, our voice producer, was literally a burrito. So. Next, temporary assistants. These are people that can help you write lines, they can help you record placeholder lines, they can implement lines into the game, they can do whatever you want them to do. And as a side note, if you happen to be in this role as a temp voice assistant, you're going to be working with a lot of influential people like producers and project managers and audio leads and design leads and things like that. So if you're in this role, keep an eye out for holes, because you're going to be working with people that could maybe help you get a job there. From the employer perspective, what's nice about temporary help is at least the plan is that their employment ends when the work ends. They're like a fixed cost. So as a rule of thumb in the audio discipline, if you're going to hire a temp audio assistant, we say hire them no later than about a month before your first recording session, and their employment ideally ends when the game submits. The point of the temporary help is to free everyone else up so that they can focus on what they're best at. And that could be writing the story, it could be designing and implementing sounds, it could be polishing and iterating sounds, it could be composing music. And it's not to imply that any set of work is necessarily more or less important than any other set of work. You just want to try to match the work up against the skills and expertise of your full-time employees. It's also important for your temporary assistants to have a clearly documented workflow. We had an in-depth manual that explained the ins and outs of Taco, our voice editor, and we also had a step-by-step guide for implementing voice, and that's what you see here behind the margarita. That is literally our step-by-step guide. The point is to save time having to support and troubleshoot issues with voice implementation. And finally, voice QA testers. QA can vary from developer to developer. So some developers have internal QA and some outsource their QA, but regardless, you should consider dedicating at least one QA tester to testing all of the voice in your game. The amount of testing required to test all of the voice can be enormous. The reason you want to do this is because QA is better at testing than we are as developers. It's their job. They're really good at it. We tend to test our work in these sort of ideal scenarios, like how it should be played. And QA can test them in a way, in the more unusual ways. And some of the things that we test for at Volition are, can every line be heard clearly? Is the timing right between lines in a conversation? Is the emotion being conveyed in that conversation, or is timing messing up the emotion? Is the most important line being played if there's multiple lines being played at the same time? Are all variations of a line being played correctly? And if a bank of lines is supposed to be played randomly, is it actually being perceived as playing randomly? Is there any particular line that's being heard too frequently or not frequently enough? Is the playback distance realistic? So those are some examples. At Volition, we also strive to provide our testers with as many tools as possible to make them efficient. We gave them full access to Taco, our voice tool. They had access to Wise. They had access to table files. We actually created some in-game tools for them to allow them to preview and test lines without having to advance through the story. And then they also had access to the biggest tool on the planet, which is me, which is double entendre. It's important to be available to answer your testers' questions and to make sure that they're getting you practical information back in a timely manner. On to the final lesson. Voice is complicated, and don't make it simpler than it really is. Voice might be simple for some games, but that was definitely not the case on Saints Row the Third. It was very complicated. And oddly, oversimplification made voice harder to teach, which was contrary to what I thought. We ended up having to make a lot of changes during post-production and mix to our voice systems, and that was a very impractical time to have to do that. Generally, being too simple made voice playback issues harder to manage in the end. So I didn't spend enough time thinking about the end of the project. I was sort of short-sighted, thinking mostly about implementation because that was what was going to be practical for me because I knew I'd be doing a lot of the implementation. But towards the end of the project, it became very impractical, and that's a nasty time to have to readjust, especially since a lot of audio work hits towards the end of the project. You don't want additional issues with voice to have to deal with at that time. So what I'm proposing is you think backwards about your voice. And so if you're going to start at the end, you start with, how are we going to mix our voice? On Saints Row the Third, we couldn't adjust the volume of a single line, for example, without actually editing the WAV file. And we've got 82,000 plus WAV files. It's impossible. It's basically impractical. So we ended up putting things like real-time compressors on certain sets of lines, and that's fine, except that it takes up time, it takes up CPU, it takes up memory, and not to mention the fact that putting compression on lines like that can crunch some of the nuances of a performance, which you don't want. So after thinking about voice in terms of mixing, now you want to think about the implementation. Voice implementation on Saints Row the Third was very straightforward, but the end goal of making it simple to mix was missing. So implementation sort of served itself rather than our long-term goals of the game. And the last question is, how do you manage your raw assets? So the flow of it is sort of you want to organize your files so that implementation is easy, and then you want to implement your files in a way that makes mixing easy. Another consideration for raw assets is that you want to be able to quickly and easily find a single line or a single subset of lines, because you're going to have people like marketing or external vendors or producers, just all kinds of random people asking you for a line. And so if you have 80,000 lines, or any number of lines really, you want to be able to quickly get that for them without having to trudge through the muck of your voice. So voice is complicated, and you're going to want to plot out your variables. There's a lot of variables that affect voice, and there were two in particular that we didn't plan for as well as we could have, and those were ducking variables and positional variables. Again, the point here is to make mixing easier. So ducking, for those of you who may not know, you probably all do. The idea is that if you have a critical line playing at the same time as an explosion, then the critical line will attenuate the volume of the explosion so that you can hear the critical line. Or if you have more than one line playing at the same time, then the more important line, will turn down the volume of this line so that you can hear the most important line. On Saints Row the Third, we started out with a very oversimplified set of ducking presets. There was only a handful of them. And ultimately, we had to shoehorn a bunch of additional ducking presets in at the end of the project, which again is a bad time to have to do these kinds of things. In the future, too, we're going to be using our prioritized list of line situations to help us determine which lines should duck other lines. So it's another good reason to have your content prioritized at every level. Positional properties, for example, 2D versus 3D. 2D means that the line is going to play at equal loudness out of some combination of your front, left, right, and center speaker. So a good example of a typical 2D line is like a player character voice line. A 3D line is going to pan between your speakers depending on the relative position between the human and 3D space and your camera or your listening position. And another property of 3D lines is fall-off distance, which is how far away can I hear this line in-game. So for example, on Saints Row the Third, if someone was screaming in agony, you'd hear that line 50 meters away. And if someone was just saying some observational line, like about your clothes or something, you'd hear that a little less than half that, about 23 meters away. Also, since it's complicated, you're going to want to document your voice processes. We did this on Saints Row the Third, although it happened a little later than I think we could have done it. The idea is that this allows you to easily hand off your work to other people, and you can also refer to it yourself when you need a refresher, and you're going to need a refresher every now and then because it's complicated. We created a step-by-step voice implementation guide, and I know that this saved us time and it prevented errors. And it was written as if the audience was completely ignorant of this process or even uncaring, like they didn't want to do this work, but we forced them to at gunpoint. So for example, it was literally like, click this icon, this menu is going to come up, click this box, breathe, inhale through your left nostril, use your index finger to press the return key, and then wait 3 seconds. It was a completely low level, and it was intentionally that way so that you could pass this work off to anyone, people off the street, and we did that a lot. You can also put notes directly into your tools. Like, for example, we put notes directly into Wise on Saints Row the Third, although we did this way too late for it to even be really useful, honestly. The most important stuff that we found to put into Wise was the ducking information and the positional information, and then we also had some, like, sometimes special rules or a quick summary of what that external source or whatever your voice object is in your tool. An example from Saints Row the Third is 3D mission voice position, full volume up to 250 meters, so that's your positional data, and must not be routed to any mission voice bus, which is, for us, that was ducking information. And then for 3D lines that are too effing quiet, that's just basically a quick summary so that we knew what to apply it towards. The hardest part of documentation, as we all know, is maintaining your documentation. What we did on Saints Row the Third is we just stored all of our voice editor or voice documentation in OneNote. And everyone had access to edit this documentation. At first, we had asked them to add comments, and then we, sort of the overlords, would selectively implement their comments into the documentation, but that was ridiculous. And what we ended up doing is letting everyone edit this documentation directly. And you might get the idea that, or be concerned that it's going to mess up all your documentation, like people are going to go and write like Wikipedia, they're just going to graffiti your documentation. But actually what happened was it kept the documentation up to date, and it allowed everyone to feel this sense of ownership over the documentation and even over the process. So those are the 3 lessons. Lesson number 1, scope your voice based on what's going to be meaningful to your player. Number 2, staff your voice team based on every last detail of the work. And number 3, voice is complicated, don't oversimplify it. This is my email address. Please feel free to email me. I love talking about this stuff. I love talking about voice. If you have questions about voice, sound, music, my personal life, anything, please don't hesitate to contact me. I really want to talk to you guys about this stuff. Lastly, you guys are going to be getting an email after this, which is going to ask you to review this session. And so I'd ask you to please do that. Make me a better presenter, make GDC a better conference, and indeed make this world a better place to live in. So also, this is right before lunch, so if you guys could, I've been asked to ask you guys if you could, never mind, I'm cutting that out. Okay, interesting. So that's it. Thank you guys for coming to my talk. Oh, okay, cool.